What's up, Elevate Leaders? Hey, today's video is going to be a little bit longer than usual. It's going to be about 10 minutes long, but we have a guest guy named Mark Oestreicher. He's one of the world gurus on student ministry, and he is going to be talking about brain development and adolescent brain development and the implications that has for spiritual growth and faith development. This is hugely important for all of us to understand as youth leaders. So take the 10 minutes out of your life, watch this video, listen to what he has to say. It's going to make you better and more effective at leading students towards Jesus. Love you guys, appreciate you guys. Check it out.
Hi guys, my name is Mark Oestreicher. People call me Marco, and I'm a partner in the Youth Cartel. And I'm excited for this opportunity to encourage you with some new stuff that's just kind of blowing my mind, and I'm super excited about it. I've done a lot of reading and research and even written books about teenage brain development, but I've just learned something new that I find so fascinating, and I think it has big time implications for our practice of youth ministry. I hope it'll challenge you like it's been challenging me. So I've drawn this to scale model of a human brain right here. I'm sure you recognize it. This is your brain not on drugs right here, okay? And I want to unpack three parts of the brain, a couple of which you may have heard of before. This first one you may have heard of because it's been talked about so much in the last decade in terms of implications for adolescent development. And it's the front part of the brain, and we call it the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's CEO. It's the decision-making center. It's the executive office. It's responsible for things like prioritization and impulse control, decision-making, wisdom, empathy, all of these higher order thinking processes that really separate us from the rest of animals. One of the fascinating parts about the prefrontal cortex and why it's so important for our understanding of teenagers is that we've discovered in the last, say, 12 or 15 years since the invention of the MRI, that part of the brain is one part that's significantly underdeveloped in teenagers. Prior to the MRI, the entire medical community thought that the brain was fully formed by about age 6. And it wasn't until the invention of the MRI that we had real-time scans of healthy teenage brains, and we discovered that this and a couple other parts are significantly underdeveloped and not finished forming until somebody's well into their mid or late 20s. This is why teenagers struggle with things like decision-making and priorities, right? And some of the reporting on this has been viewed through a lens of teenagers are broken and they're incapable. And when you view it, the research that way, you can conclude, as so many people have, see, this just confirms what we always knew about teenagers. They're not capable of making good decisions, so we should continue to treat them as if they're little children. We should remove any opportunity to make good decisions in the spirit of protecting them. And we should remove responsibility, and in doing all of that, we've continued to prolong adolescence and remove the on-ramps to adulthood, right? The other opportunity of a lens to view this through is, instead of teenagers are broken or a problem to be solved, instead the opportunity is to view them as a wonder to behold. And so I would suggest, from a creation viewpoint, what might God's intention have been in creating the human brain, specifically the teenage brain, with a prefrontal cortex that is not yet fully developed? We all know, just from our practice of youth ministry, just from our engagement with real teenagers, that they are really good at risk and passion. And those are two functions of an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. And those two things, risk and passion, are things that can be, if viewed properly, a great gift to our churches and to our ministries. So you might have already heard about that. Another thing I want to point out is this little almond-shaped thing right down here. It's literally about the size of an almond, and because the brain has two halves, it literally is like two halves of an almond. And it is called the amygdala. Amygdala, if I can spell it. Amygdala. The amygdala is this kind kind of like really old part of the brain, sometimes we're in a part of the brain that's referred to as our lizard brain. Really, that's how scientists even talk about it. And it's the fear center of the brain, fear and anger, but specifically fear. And when you're overwhelmed with a sense of fear, your amygdala is firing like crazy, and it's just overriding everything else in the brain. So if you've got an amygdala that's totally highly developed, if you operate from a place of fear on a regular basis, that overrides your prefrontal cortex. You know this from experience. Sometimes when you're experiencing significant fear, you're not able to process it rationally. This is rational and logical thought, and the amygdala can override that. Now, these are parts of the brain I already understood, but the new thing that I've just learned about that's so fascinating is something that's in between, in this zone right here, and it is called the anterior cingulate. And I want you guys to all learn this phrase, anterior cingulate. Say it with me, anterior cingulate. The anterior cingulate, by the way, anterior means forward, right, as opposed to posterior. Anterior cingulate is this interesting part of the brain that functions as a buffer between the fear center of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And it allows us to kind of override both of these. In some ways, it's almost like a fulcrum that we have the amygdala over here, and we have the logic of the prefrontal cortex over here, and the anterior cingulate sits right here and provides a balancing of those two. But here's what the new research is showing us. There's a fascinating book, by the way, called How God Changes Your Brain that unpacks all of this. And what it tells us is that people with a highly developed anterior cingulate are able to conceive of God as compassionate and personal. And they're more likely to be able to notice other people and their needs. And the anterior cingulate, when it is functioning well, it actually overrides or allows us to tamp down the fear that otherwise wants to overwhelm us. Now, a couple things to unpack this a little bit. Think about what kind of faith would be dominant if we have a part of our brain that is driving our faith. If you have a faith driven by a highly developed prefrontal cortex, you will have a logical and rational faith. Even an atheist might have a highly developed prefrontal cortex and be able to logically and rationally defend their position. And you've met, I'm sure, people who call themselves Christians and maybe are fully functioning Christians who really approach it from a logical, rational place. Of course, there are also people who operate primarily in their faith from a place of fear, and even kind of sections of the church primarily speak to this. This is not what we would consider a healthy or a thriving faith, right? What we really want is to understand God and ourselves in this place of love and compassion, right? So now the question comes, how do we develop this? Oh, here's where it gets really exciting. These two leading neuroscientists, neither of whom are Christians, which I think gives this a little bit more credibility. Their findings in research that they did was that the number one way to develop the anterior cingulate is prayer and meditation. By far greater than any other way. In fact, one of the studies they did was they took people who had never had any experience with prayer and meditation and got them to commit to 8 to 10 minutes a day, 6 days a week. And they found that within 2 months, there was a 50% increase in the functionality of the anterior cingulate, and that increase was permanent. You guys, this is how prayer changes us. I'm sure you've said to your teenagers before, yes, God is moved by prayer, but prayer also changes us. This is literally how prayer changes us. When we spend time daily in prayer and meditation, hopeful prayer and meditation, not fear-based prayer and meditation, right? But hopeful prayer and meditation, it rewires our brains, builds our capacity to understand God as compassionate and loving. The second biggest way to increase the strengthen the functionality of the anterior cingulate, faith-based singing. This is what the research says, faith-based singing. And just thinking about a song doesn't do it, just listening to a song doesn't do it. You have to actually intone it and sing the tune and the words. It doesn't even matter what the words are, it's more of a meditation put to music. And so if we can build in our teenagers a capacity, a practice, by the way, once a week, twice a week, doesn't have a big impact on your interior cingulate. If we can build a daily practice of prayer and meditation and a little bit of singing, we actually can play a role in stewarding the development of teenage brains for a lifetime of faith, of vibrant and active faith. What if our top priority was becoming champions of the interior cingulate in our teenagers?